She slid the divorce papers across the table with a defiant smile, testing my love. I picked up the pen, read every page, and signed without a tremor. What she did not know was that I had already seen the forged signatures, the drained accounts, and the man leaving my house at 5 in the morning using her passcode. She thought she was setting a trap. Actually, she had just locked the door from the inside. I am Isla James. I am 37 years old, and I was sitting perfectly still in the dining room of the historic Savannah carriage house. My wife and I had spent the last 7 years resurrecting from ruins. The air in the room was heavy with the thick, cloying humidity typical of a Georgia evening, bleeding through the original glass panes of the windows. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. We had just finished our anniversary dinner. The remains of a costly meal sat between us on the polished oak table, flanked by the fading light of expensive taper candles. Across the table sat Marin Whitlow, the woman I had built my life around. She reached down beside her chair, her fingers trailing along the edge of her designer bag. When her hand reappeared, she was holding a thick, heavy manila envelope. She placed it on the table. With a smooth, deliberate push, she slid it across the polished wood. The friction made a dry, rasping sound that seemed to echo in the quiet room. Marin leaned back, crossing her arms over her silk blouse. A smile played on her lips. It was a smile I used to find charming, but tonight it looked distinctly like a challenge. She tilted her head and announced, in a voice dripping with manufactured innocence, that the envelope contained a prank. A little test, she called it. She wanted to see how I would react. She claimed she needed to know if I still cared enough to fight for us, to see if the rigid, predictable Isla James had any passion left to salvage our marriage. I did not react to the bait. I kept my face entirely neutral. I picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive legal stock. I broke the seal and pulled the contents free. It was a massive stack of documents, professionally bound at the corner. As my eyes scanned the first page, the temperature in my blood seemed to drop a few degrees. This was no novelty gag gift purchased from a joke shop. It was a masterclass in legal preparation. It was a comprehensive, ironclad petition for the dissolution of marriage. I turned the first page slowly. The documents were breathtakingly thorough. There was a meticulous division of our marital assets, broken down to the decimal point. There were current, highly accurate market valuations of the carriage house we were sitting in. There were exhaustive payment schedules mapped out for the next 5 years. There were itemized lists of our joint business accounts, routing numbers included. Every blank space had been filled out. Every checkbox had been marked. It was a loaded weapon, handed to me barrel first. My eyes moved down the dense paragraphs of legalese. I have spent my entire professional life dealing with contracts, compliance, and corporate fraud. I read the fine print for a living, where a normal spouse would be blinded by tears or paralyzed by the sheer shock of a divorce decree. My brain automatically shifted into an analytical gear. Then, I found it. Page 4, subsection C. It was buried deep within the operational restructuring clauses. It was a single sentence stating that upon execution of this document, Marin Whitlow would be recognized as the sole managing member of our lucrative event planning business, effective retroactively to the first quarter of the year. It was a brilliant, venomous trap. It was the kind of obscure legal maneuver that a panicked, heartbroken partner would completely overlook while arguing about who gets the house. If I had signed it in a blind fit of emotional devastation just to make the pain stop, I would have legally surrendered my entire stake in the company we built from the ground up, granting her absolute financial and operational control. I did not gasp. I did not throw the papers in her face. I did not beg her to tell me she was joking. Instead, I shifted slightly in my chair. I lowered my left hand beneath the edge of the dining table. My fingers found my phone in my pocket. I unlocked it purely by touch. I opened the camera application, resting the lens just over the edge of my lap. With slow, calculated movements, I angled the critical pages downward and blindly snapped rapid, silent photographs. I made absolutely certain I captured the property division schedules and the venomous clause regarding the business control. The camera shutter made no sound. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Then, I reached across the table and picked up my heavy silver fountain pen. I uncapped it. I placed the cold metal tip against the thick paper. I signed my full name on the first designated line. My hand did not shake. The ink flowed dark and permanent. I turned the page, found the next sticky flag, initialed the margin, and signed again. I moved with a cold, terrifying efficiency. I was not signing away my life. I was accepting her terms of engagement. Across the table, the atmosphere abruptly shattered. The smug, playful smile on Marin's face stopped dead. Her posture stiffened. She watched my hand glide across the paper, her eyes tracking the dark blue ink. When I calmly flipped to the third page and pressed the pen down once more, the color completely drained from her cheeks. The game was no longer following her script. Marin lunged forward. Her chair scraped violently against the reclaimed pine floor. She slammed both of her hands down onto the documents, her fingers digging frantically into the pages, trying to wrench the papers away from my grip. Her voice broke the silence, high and tight with sudden, unscripted panic. She stammered that I was doing it all wrong. She insisted that I had completely misunderstood the entire meaning of the prank. Her breath hitched as she told me I was supposed to tear the papers to pieces, that I was supposed to yell at her, tell her I loved her, and prove that I would never, ever let her go without a fight. I let go of the pages. I allowed her to snatch them back into her chest. I capped my pen with a sharp, decisive click and set it down next to my empty wine glass. I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands comfortably in my lap. I looked directly into her wide, panicked eyes. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I pushed my chair back slightly. My voice was quiet, even, and entirely devoid of warmth when I finally spoke. "If it is a prank, then nothing is lost," I said softly. "But if it is not, you just got exactly what you prepared." She stared at me. Her chest heaved. She clutched the slightly crumpled stack of documents like they were burning her hands. She really thought she had outsmarted me. She thought she had cornered a woman too rigid to fight back, a woman who would fold under the emotional weight of a sudden ambush. Marin thought she was setting a trap, but she had no idea what was actually happening in the shadows of her own life. She did not know that long before this anniversary dinner, long before she printed those pages and rehearsed her little performance. I had already done my own reading. She had no idea that I had already spent the last 2 weeks tracking down the hidden shell company she had quietly set up under her maiden name. She did not know that I had already found the digital trail of forged electronic signatures bearing my name on massive loan applications. And most importantly, Marin did not know that I had already pulled the security logs and the camera footage from our perimeter system. I had sat in the dark, watching high-definition video of Gavin Rusk, our supposedly professional contractor. I watched him walking out of our shared property at exactly 5 a.m. on a Tuesday, casually punching in the master security code on the keypad like he owned the place. She thought she had backed me into a corner tonight. In reality, she had just handed me the very rope I needed to hang her. I am the daughter of a union electrician and a public school secretary. In my childhood home, love was not expressed through grand, sweeping declarations, expensive gifts, or spontaneous weekend getaways. Love was a balanced checkbook, a thoroughly vetted insurance policy, and the strict insistence that you read every single line of a contract before you put your name on it. My father used to tell me that a poor connection behind drywall could burn a whole house to the ground while everyone inside was sleeping comfortably. He meant the electrical wiring, of course, but as I grew older, I applied his lesson to people. That blue-collar upbringing forged me into someone highly disciplined, deeply cautious, and to the outside world, undeniably dry. I do not believe in magic, and I do not trust sudden miracles. I believe in compliance. For the past decade, I have worked as the Senior Compliance Director at Seabrier Civic Development Group. We handle massive urban redevelopment projects across the state. My daily existence revolves around parsing through dense municipal zoning permits, dissecting bloated contractor agreements, and aggressively auditing municipal funds for property fraud. If a corporate developer tries to hide a kickback in a foundation pour, I find the discrepancy. If a subcontractor uses substandard materials and bills the city for premium goods, I redline the invoice and report them. I am professionally trained to look at a beautiful, newly constructed building and immediately search for the structural lie holding it all together. That exact mindset was how I approached the carriage house. Years ago, long before the boutique wedding market exploded and took over our lives, I inherited a modest sum of money from my late aunt. She was a practical, fiercely independent woman who saved her pennies her entire life, and she left me just enough to purchase a crumbling, historically protected carriage house in the heart of Savannah. When I bought it, the roof was sagging dangerously. The original brickwork was weeping moisture, and the plumbing was an absolute disaster. I bought it anyway. It was my sanctuary. I spent my evenings and my weekends pulling municipal permits, sanding 100-year-old pine floors by hand until my knuckles bled, and mapping out the electrical grids. It was a slow, grueling resurrection, funded entirely by my aunt's legacy and my own sweat. Then, Marin swept into my world. If I was the solid, unyielding earth, she was a sudden, intoxicating coastal wind. She was wildly charismatic, blindingly gorgeous, and possessed a silver tongue that could talk a dying plant into blooming. When she first walked into the dusty, half-finished living room of my carriage house, she did not see a construction zone. She saw a gold mine. Marin envisioned a luxury destination for high-end, intimate ceremonies. She knew exactly how to pitch the rustic, Southern Gothic charm of the property to desperate brides willing to pay a massive premium. In the beginning, our dynamic was a masterpiece of balance. We were two halves of a perfectly functioning engine. I laid the concrete, secured the commercial zoning variances, drafted the ironclad liability waivers, and managed the complex tax structures. Marin brought the magic. She curated breathtaking table settings, charmed the most difficult clients into signing massive deposits right on the spot, and gave the venue a heartbeat. I built the stage, and she was the star of the show. But slowly, the foundation began to crack under the weight of her escalating ambition. Over the last 3 years, the wedding industry mutated, and Marin mutated right along with it. The business shifted from hosting intimate, meaningful celebrations to manufacturing viral, influencer-driven spectacles. It was no longer about the couple getting married. It was about the brand we were projecting. Marin became fiercely obsessed with our digital footprint. She insisted we needed imported silk linens, custom crystal glassware that broke if a guest looked at it wrong, and elaborate floral installations that cost tens of thousands of dollars just to maintain our elite status in the magazine spreads. She argued constantly that we had to spend heavy money to stay relevant, but I am an auditor. I know how math works. I started noticing that the staggering revenue we were pulling in was evaporating the moment it hit our accounts. The numbers simply did not align with the brilliant, successful smile Marin wore in her daily social media posts. The profit margins were shrinking dangerously while her aesthetic demands grew wilder by the month. And then, there was the contractor, Gavin Rusk. He entered our orbit as a necessary evil, a fix-it-all local guy hired to handle a tricky expansion of the rear courtyard because our usual crew was booked. At first, his name was just a casual mention over dinner. Gavin managed to get the courtyard permit rushed. Gavin figured out how to bypass the drainage issue near the old oak tree. Gavin saved the day. But as the months bled into years, the context of his name shifted drastically. He stopped being a contractor and started becoming a permanent fixture in my home. I would return from the Seabriar office tired and wanting quiet, only to find him drinking iced tea in my kitchen at 3 p.m, laughing with my wife over inside jokes I did not understand. Marin's sentences began to start with his name far too often. Gavin thinks the west wall needs softer lighting to pop on camera. Gavin understands how stressful this wedding season is for me. Gavin said you were probably just too wrapped up in your corporate spreadsheets to see the true creative vision. He morphed from a hired hand into the man who supposedly understood the soul of my wife better than I ever could. He fed her ego, enabling her reckless spending by promising cheap labor on grand designs, blurring the professional boundaries until they were entirely erased. He would stand entirely too close to her when reviewing blueprints, smelling of cheap cologne and sawdust, looking at me with a subtle, mocking smirk that challenged my authority in my own home. Most spouses, upon feeling that sickening, hollow drop in their stomach, would confront their partner immediately. They would demand answers, scream, throw a heavy vase against the wall, or dissolve into a puddle of tears. They would let the fear and the betrayal drive them into a messy, emotional confrontation, demanding the truth right then and there. I do not operate that way. When the subtle shift in Marin's affection perfectly matched the inexplicable bleeding of our business accounts, my inherited instincts took over. I became the union electrician checking the faulty wire for a spark. I became the compliance director quietly auditing a corrupt construction site. I did not slam my fists on the kitchen island. I simply stopped talking and started observing everything. I began cataloging dates and hours. I took quiet screenshots of deleted text messages. I cross-referenced the exact times Gavin claimed to be on-site working with the actual invoices he submitted to our joint account. I quietly pulled our bank statements and matched them against the vendor payouts, hunting for the missing capital. I built a silent, invisible fortress of data while Marin paraded around, entirely convinced I was just a boring, neglectful partner buried in paperwork. She mistook my silence for ignorance. She mistook my lack of screaming for a lack of awareness. She thought my rigid, disciplined nature made me a passive, easily manipulated victim in my own marriage. That is exactly why I did not freeze in terror when the time came. She thought her actions were a brilliant, spontaneous ambush that would leave me devastated and compliant. She did not realize that I had already spent months mapping the entire battlefield. My actions were never an act of blind submission. They were the calculated opening moves of a woman who had spent her entire professional life learning exactly how to dismantle a crooked, rotting structure from the inside out. The shift from suspicion to undeniable proof did not happen with a dramatic confession or a tearful breakdown. It arrived on a mundane Tuesday afternoon in the form of an automated, system-generated email. Years ago, when I first purchased the property, I registered for a county clerk title alert service as a standard security measure. It was a digital tripwire designed to notify the property owner if any new liens or public financial claims were attached to the deed. I was sitting at my desk at the Seabrier office, reviewing a massive municipal zoning permit, when the notification chimed on my monitor. The subject line indicated a new financial filing had been recorded against our home address. I had not authorized a single line of credit, nor had I signed any refinancing agreements in the past 3 years. I immediately closed my office door, locked it, and logged directly into the county public records database. I pulled the newly recorded document. It was a Uniform Commercial Code financing statement. The debtor listed at the top of the page was not our legally established joint partnership. Instead, the entity claiming the debt was a completely foreign corporation registered as Whitlow Event Holdings Limited Liability Company. Whitlow. My wife had used her maiden name to create a shadow company. I scrolled down to the collateral section. The list was staggering and incredibly specific. It claimed the custom oak dining tables, the imported crystal chandeliers, the high-end audiovisual equipment, and even the antique wall sconces that were physically hardwired into the plaster of our home. I requested the full electronic signature packet from the registry. When the completion certificate loaded onto my screen, a cold, heavy wave washed over me. There was my signature, rendered in a generic, cursive computer font, confirming my supposed consent to leverage our assets. Directly beneath the signature block was the routing email address used to verify the signer. At a quick glance, it looked perfectly normal, but my eyes are professionally trained to spot microscopic discrepancies in massive stacks of data. The letter L in my name had been quietly replaced by a capital letter I. The addresses looked visually identical on a screen, but they routed to entirely different servers. It was just one single character off. It was a clever enough trick to bypass an automated verification algorithm, but it was an incredibly foolish move to try against a woman who audits corporate fraud for a living. That weekend, Marin flew to a luxury floral convention on the West Coast. The moment her flight tracker showed she was in the air, I went to work. I dug through the back of our utility closet and found the old tablet we previously used for venue management before she upgraded to a newer system. The battery was completely dead. I plugged it in, waited for it to charge to 12%, and powered it on. The device had not been connected to the internet in months, meaning the local files had not been synced to the cloud or wiped clean. I opened the offline booking calendar and began cross-referencing the dates with the financial reports she had verbally given me. The lies materialized in stark, undeniable color coding. Over the past 8 months, she had explicitly told me that the carriage house was closed for mandatory maintenance on at least 5 separate weekends. She had complained about imaginary plumbing issues and expensive floor refinishing that required the property to be completely empty. The local calendar on the tablet showed those exact same weekends blocked out in bright red, marked as fully booked for premium tier clients. She had been running ghost events. The venue had been full, the champagne had been poured, the music had played, and the revenue from those massive parties was entirely missing from our primary ledgers. The following morning, I drove out to the industrial park on the dusty outskirts of town, where we maintained a climate-controlled storage unit. I unlocked the heavy steel door and flipped on the overhead fluorescent lights. The cavernous space was packed tight with towering stacks of premium velvet seating, massive brass archways, and elaborate table centerpieces. Marin had proudly claimed she purchased these items outright during a massive liquidation sale. I began opening the filing boxes pushed into the corner. I found a plastic clipboard buried under a stack of linen catalogs. Clipped to the board were the actual procurement contracts. They were not bills of sale. They were predatory, deferred payment lease agreements. They carried exorbitant compound interest rates that were scheduled to kick in after 90 days. We did not own a single piece of the lavish inventory she paraded on social media. She had built a mountain of invisible, toxic debt. The financial betrayal was a cold, calculated reality. The emotional betrayal, however, required a different kind of confirmation. I returned to the house and accessed the secure cloud server that stored our exterior perimeter camera footage. I filtered the massive video logs, specifically isolating the unusual hours between midnight and dawn. I scrolled back to the second week of October. During that specific week, I had been 400 miles away in Atlanta, attending a mandatory state development conference. I clicked on a flagged timestamp. The video player loaded a crisp, night vision feed of the rear courtyard. The screen was bathed in an eerie green glow. The timestamp at the bottom corner read 5:12 in the morning. The heavy oak door of the carriage house slowly opened from the inside. Gavin stepped out onto the brick pathway. He was wearing the exact same clothes he had been wearing when he supposedly left the property the previous afternoon. He did not look around nervously. He did not rush. He casually turned around, punched the master security code into the keypad to engage the deadbolt, walked down the driveway to his heavy-duty truck, and drove away into the pre-dawn darkness. It was far too early for any legitimate emergency repair, and it was entirely too intimate for a casual vendor visit. I did not shatter a glass. I did not scream into the empty house. I methodically downloaded every single PDF document, exported every high-definition video file onto an encrypted flash drive, and printed hard copies of the toxic lease agreements. I placed the entire collection into a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Then, I picked up my phone and made a highly specific phone call. I booked a private, closed-door consultation with Lorraine Beck. Lorraine was a family law attorney universally feared in the local legal circuit. She possessed a reputation for a surgical, utterly emotionless approach to dismantling high-net-worth marriages. I sat in Lorraine's sterile, glass-walled office and placed the portfolio onto the center of her heavy mahogany desk. She reviewed the documents in absolute, unbroken silence. She traced the fraudulent email address, analyzed the hidden limited liability company, and reviewed the unauthorized UCC filings. When she finally finished, she closed the folder and looked up at me. She did not offer a single word of empty sympathy. She offered pure, tactical strategy. Lorraine pointed out the terrifying crux of Marin's grand design. Marin was not just having an affair. She was actively preparing to sever our marital ties while simultaneously trapping me beneath the crushing weight of the hidden debt. She was drafting the legal framework to ensure she walked away with total operational control of the revenue streams, leaving me holding the empty bag of liabilities. Lorraine leaned forward, interlaced her fingers, and gave me the legal instruction that would dictate my every move from that moment forward. She told me that if Marin ever actually presented those separation papers under any guise, I needed to let the trap spring perfectly. Lorraine explained that by signing the documents exactly when and where requested, I would legally solidify Marin's sole management status right before the entire fraudulent financial structure collapsed. That single signature would effectively sever my legal liability and shield me entirely from the impending blast radius. Following the strict, emotionless directives laid out by Lorraine Beck, my life transformed into a covert auditing operation. The investigation was no longer about a broken heart or a betrayed marriage. It was a forensic dissection of a crime scene. I operated entirely in the shadows, waiting until Marin was asleep or out of the house to begin my work. I systematically pulled every single piece of financial documentation I could access. I downloaded months of bank statements, merchant processing records, vendor payment schedules, commercial insurance policies, and the complete history of wire transfers moving in and out of the business accounts associated with the carriage house. I printed everything and laid the papers out across the floor of my locked home office, arranging them by date and transaction type. To an untrained eye, it would look like a chaotic sea of numbers. To a senior compliance director, a terrifying and crystal-clear pattern immediately emerged from the ink. Marin was not just overspending on luxury floral arrangements and imported linens. She was actively running a massive, desperate shell game to keep her entirely insolvent business afloat. I discovered that she had signed up for multiple merchant cash advances. These are essentially predatory, high-interest loans disguised as business capital. The terms were catastrophic. The lenders were sweeping our operating accounts on a daily basis, extracting a fixed percentage of our incoming revenue before we even had a chance to pay our utility bills. To cover these staggering daily losses, Marin had resorted to a textbook Ponzi structure. She was aggressively taking massive, non-refundable deposits from new brides for weddings scheduled 12 to 18 months in the future. She would immediately drain those new deposits to pay the overdue catering invoices, the late fees, and the angry demands for refunds from clients whose events were happening in 30 days. The business was a hollow, rotting carcass painted over with a beautiful pastel veneer. The deeper I dug into the vendor payouts, the more frequently the name Gavin Rusk appeared on the ledgers. There were dozens of invoices submitted under his contracting license, all labeled as emergency repairs or expedited structural improvements. The billing amounts were staggering, often totaling tens of thousands of dollars per month. I pulled his specific invoices and compared them against the reality of our physical property. One invoice, dated 6 weeks prior, claimed he had completely rebuilt the subflooring and replaced the foundational joists beneath the East Conservatory. I waited until a Sunday afternoon when Marin was out at a bridal expo. I put on my work clothes, took a heavy-duty flashlight, and crawled directly into the tight, claustrophobic space beneath the conservatory. I scanned the wood above my head. The foundational joists were the exact same rough-hewn, original pine beams installed over 1 century ago. They were covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of gray dust and ancient spider webs. There was not a single new piece of lumber, no fresh nails, and absolutely no signs of recent labor. He was submitting fraudulent invoices for phantom construction, and Marin was eagerly approving them, funneling our marital assets directly into his pockets under the guise of legitimate business expenses. But the most unforgivable discovery was buried in the fine print of the commercial insurance and collateral records. When I finally obtained the complete, itemized addendum attached to that shadow company she had created, I found out exactly what she had pledged to the predatory lenders. It was not just the leased dining chairs or the audio-visual equipment. Marin had specifically listed the antique mahogany sideboards, the Persian rugs, and the vintage silver service sets I had purchased using the final, remaining funds from my late aunt's estate. She had taken the legacy of the woman who practically raised me, the very money that allowed us to buy this property in the first place, and she had quietly handed it over to high-interest creditors as collateral for her fraudulent debts. I brought this entire mountain of evidence to Lorraine. She handed the digital files over to her forensic investigator to extract the hidden metadata and recover deleted communications from the cloud backups I had secured. 2 days later, Lorraine called me back into her glass-walled office. When I sat down, she did not hand me a financial spreadsheet. She turned her large computer monitor around so I could read the screen. It was a recovered text message thread between Marin and Gavin, dating back almost 3 months. This was the moment the situation escalated from a devastating financial theft to a calculated campaign of psychological abuse. They were not exchanging romantic messages. They were actively scripting my legal and emotional destruction. In the messages, Gavin complained that I was always in the way, lurking around the property like a prison guard. He told Marin they needed a bulletproof reason to force me out of the carriage house permanently. Marin responded by complaining that I was too controlled, too stoic, and impossible to provoke. Their solution was terrifyingly malicious. They outlined a specific plan to push me into a violent, emotional explosion. Gavin suggested purchasing a discreet, motion-activated camera and hiding it in the kitchen. Marin agreed, stating she would wait until I was exhausted from work, and then she would aggressively corner me, attacking my character, threatening my career, and pushing every psychological button she knew until I finally lost my temper and screamed, or ideally, threw something across the room. Their ultimate goal was to capture my manufactured rage on video, march straight to the county courthouse, and file for an emergency protective order. They wanted to weaponize the legal system, framing me as a volatile, controlling, and dangerous spouse, which would immediately grant Marin exclusive occupancy of our home and full operational control of the property. Reading those text messages eradicated the final, lingering trace of warmth I held for the woman I had married. I looked across the desk at Lorraine. I asked her if we should confront Marin immediately and shut the entire circus down before she could attempt her performance. Lorraine shook her head slowly. She leaned forward and delivered a piece of advice that would define the rest of my life. She told me that stopping the upcoming prank would be a catastrophic tactical error. If I revealed my hand now, Marin would immediately play the victim, delete whatever remaining evidence she could reach, and completely alter her legal narrative. However, Lorraine explained, if Marin voluntarily presented me with a fully drafted, heavily biased separation agreement masquerading as a joke, it would serve as the ultimate, irrefutable proof of her premeditation. It would legally demonstrate her prior intent to defraud me and her deliberate attempt to restructure our finances in her favor. Lorraine ordered me to let the trap spring. So, I followed orders. For 14 agonizing days, I lived with a ghost who wanted to destroy me. I drank coffee with her in the morning. I asked about her client meetings. I smiled when she kissed my cheek. I played the role of the oblivious, predictable, emotionally rigid corporate wife to absolute perfection, lulling her into a false sense of absolute security. I let her believe she was holding all the cards, holding my gaze steady, while I knew she was plotting to steal my home and ruin my name, which brings everything back to the night of our anniversary dinner. When Marin slid that thick manila envelope across the polished oak table, she truly believed she was initiating a masterstroke of emotional manipulation. She thought I would crumble, cry, and beg. She did not know that the moment I pulled my phone out under the table to photograph the sole managing member clause, I was not just keeping a record, I was signaling my attorney. The second I signed my name in cold, dark ink on those dotted lines, I validated the very document she intended to use as a weapon, cementing it as a legally binding admission of her premeditated corporate restructuring. While Marin was sitting across from me, hyperventilating, clawing at the papers, and desperately trying to claim it was all just a terrible misunderstanding. The wheels of consequence were already turning at a blinding speed. Within 60 minutes of my signature hitting that page, Lorraine's paralegal electronically filed a comprehensive emergency notice of evidence preservation, a spoliation letter to all her vendors, and a preliminary financial injunction with the county clerk. I did not have to scream. I did not have to throw a glass against the wall for her hidden cameras. I just sat there, perfectly calm, watching the color drain from her face. By the time Marin even thought about calling her own lawyer the following morning to try and spin her narrative, the legal concrete had already been poured, set, and permanently sealed around her ankles. The morning sun cut through the tall glass panes of the kitchen at exactly 7 o'clock. I was already dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, standing perfectly still by the cold marble island with a cup of black coffee in my hand. I had not slept a single minute during the night. The carriage house was dead quiet, completely stripped of the manufactured romance and the expensive candles from the evening before. I was waiting. I knew the rules of engagement. I knew that after a failed ambush, the aggressor always attempts to reset the board. Then, I heard her soft footsteps descending the wooden stairs. Marin walked into the kitchen, and it was immediately clear that she had spent the last 2 hours meticulously curating her appearance for this specific confrontation. Her eyes were authentically red and puffy, suggesting a long, agonizing night of profound sorrow, but her hair was perfectly smoothed into a flawless, effortless knot. She was wearing a soft, oversized cashmere sweater that draped over her shoulders, making her look deliberately fragile and small. She was preparing to play the victim of a tragic misunderstanding. She stopped at the edge of the kitchen island, keeping a calculated distance between us. She did not yell. She did not throw things. Instead, she used a fragile, trembling voice, asking me how I could possibly sign my name so quickly after all our years together. She looked at me with a perfectly calibrated expression of heartbreak, demanding to know how a person could erase nearly a decade of marriage in a matter of seconds without shedding a single tear. I took a slow sip of my coffee and placed the ceramic mug gently on the counter. I refused to engage with the emotional bait. I did not defend my capacity for love, nor did I explain my lack of visible devastation. I looked directly into her puffy eyes and shifted the conversation entirely to the realm of hard facts. I asked her in a flat, even tone for a full financial disclosure of the Shadow Limited Liability Company. I asked her to explain the exact timeline of when she began transferring our marital debt into that entity. Finally, I asked her for the specific name of the legal professional who had helped her draft a remarkably thorough 60-page separation agreement just for a simple, harmless prank. Marin physically recoiled as if I had struck her. The soft, fragile demeanor instantly vanished, hardening into something incredibly sharp and defensive. The mention of the corporate entity completely derailed her rehearsed script. She violently sidestepped my questions about the finances. Instead, she launched right into her favorite psychological offensive. She accused me of being a machine. She told me I was pathologically cold, that I treated our sacred union like a soulless corporate merger, and that my terrifyingly calm reaction last night proved I never really loved her at all. It was classic, textbook deflection. Whenever she was cornered by undeniable facts, she aggressively attacked my personality, desperately trying to make the argument about my tone rather than her actions. I let her talk to the empty air. I did not raise my voice to interrupt her. I simply picked up my laptop from the counter, walked past her, and went straight into my private study, locking the heavy oak door behind me. I had a precise, critical list of tasks to execute before the business day officially began. I opened my email client and drafted formal, aggressively worded legal directives to our commercial insurance provider, our primary merchant payment processor, and 3 of our most critical, high-volume vendors. I informed them that, effective immediately, any and all financial transactions, account modifications, or line of credit extensions connected to the carriage house or the event business required my explicit, written, dual authorization. I systematically severed her ability to unilaterally siphon funds or leverage our property, The digital gates slammed shut with every message I sent, locking down the crumbling empire she had built. I knew Marin's next move would be to scour the house for leverage, looking for anything she could use to hurt me or hold over my head during a messy asset division. Before she could even process what was happening with the frozen accounts, I walked swiftly into the master bedroom. I pulled a sturdy leather tote bag from the back of my closet and moved with silent, ruthless purpose. I gathered the original property deeds, the thick stack of inheritance paperwork from my late aunt, and a heavy wooden box containing her handwritten personal diaries. I also packed the vintage silver frames and several small, irreplaceable family heirlooms that I had purchased entirely with my separate inherited funds long before Marin and I were married. I carried the heavy bag straight out to my car, drove directly to my bank downtown, and locked every single item inside a secure, fireproof deposit box. I was not going to give her the opportunity to casually throw away my family history in a fit of manufactured rage. When I returned to the carriage house just before noon, Marin tried a completely different strategy. The defensive anger from the morning was completely gone. I found her sitting on the living room sofa, holding a framed photograph from our second year together. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. She started talking about the early days, trying to summon the ghost of the woman I used to be. She brought up a rainy weekend trip we took to a small cabin in the mountains, painting a vivid picture of a time when things were simple, honest, and deeply connected. Her voice broke perfectly on cue as she offered a desperate compromise. She softly suggested that we could just tear the papers up, throw them in the fireplace, forget the terrible night ever happened, and start over. If only I would be willing to listen to her emotional needs more closely. It was a breathtaking performance. She was offering to generously forgive me for surviving the trap she had meticulously built. I stood in the doorway, my posture rigid, my expression completely blank. I coldly informed her that the papers were already in the possession of my legal counsel, that the merchant accounts were frozen, and that there was absolutely nothing left in this house to tear up. The reality of her extreme boundary violations manifested in physical form later that same afternoon. I was standing near the window of my study, looking out over the rear courtyard. It was roughly 3 o'clock. The sun was casting long shadows across the brick patio. I watched Gavin walk up the stone pathway. He did not go to the main entrance. He did not ring the bell. He did not even bother to knock. He walked directly to the side door of the renovated annex, casually punched the secure passcode into the digital lock, and walked right inside as if he were returning to his own living room. It was a minuscule detail in the grand scheme of the massive financial fraud, but it was a visceral, sickening confirmation of just how thoroughly I had been replaced in my own territory. He moved through my property with the absolute, unquestioned entitlement of a man who firmly believed he already owned the space and the woman inside it. The final strike of the day did not happen within the walls of the house. It happened in the digital arena, where Marin wielded her true power. Just after 8 o'clock in the evening, my phone buzzed with a sudden notification from a mutual acquaintance in the wedding industry. I opened the application. Marin had published her first public statement to her massive following. It was a beautifully lit, expertly edited, melancholic photograph of her standing alone on a misty beach, looking out at the horizon. The caption beneath the photo was a masterpiece of subtle character assassination. She wrote a long, poetic paragraph about the painful journey of self-discovery and the agony of outgrowing the places you once called home. She wrote a devastatingly smooth sentence about choosing peace instead of continuing to disappear in a marriage that constantly made her feel small, controlled, and entirely unheard. She did not mention my name once. She did not mention the forged digital signatures, the hidden predatory debt, or the contractor who knew our private security codes. She just painted a stunning, heartbreaking portrait of a brave, creative woman escaping a cold, oppressive captor. Within minutes, the post was flooded with hundreds of sympathetic comments from clients, vendors, and friends who immediately assumed I was the monster in the story. She had officially moved the war out of the dining room and into the public eye. She was trying to destroy my reputation before the legal battle even began. confident that her beautiful narrative would easily overpower my quiet truth. Marin's post was a masterclass in modern American character assassination. She did not explicitly type my name, but in the incestuous, highly connected ecosystem of the Savannah wedding industry, she did not have to. The poetic narrative of the stifled, creative soul breaking free from an emotionally rigid captor had my fingerprints painted all over it. By the following morning, my phone had transformed into a radioactive object. The messages began rolling in, neatly divided into 3 distinct categories. First, there were the polite interrogations from mutual friends, carefully disguised as wellness checks. They would send long, sympathetic texts saying they were thinking of us during this difficult transition, subtly waiting to see if I would take the bait and start throwing mud. Then came the absolute, deafening silence from the local vendors who relied on Marin for their seasonal income. People I had shared holiday dinners with suddenly treated me like a ghost. Finally, there were the neutral observers, the competing event planners and local socialites who sent simple heart emojis, practically pulling up a chair and grabbing popcorn to watch the bloodbath unfold in real time. I did not draft a fiery rebuttal. I did not post my own carefully lit photograph holding a cup of herbal tea, staring bravely into the distance. In the court of public opinion, the first person to scream often captures the initial wave of sympathy, but in a court of law, the person who speaks first is usually the one who bleeds out. I knew that survival in this specific kind of modern warfare did not depend on who had the most supportive comments on a social media feed. It depended entirely on who possessed the cleaner paper trail. My silence was not a surrender. It was a heavily fortified bunker. Lorraine strictly forbade any public defense. Instead, she drafted a singular, brutally sterile communication on her firm's heavy letterhead. We issued a brief, boilerplate legal notice directly to our commercial partners, the catering companies, the floral wholesalers, and the valet services. The letter contained no emotion, no accusations, and no dramatic poetry. It simply stated that the Carriage House venue and its associated financial entities were currently undergoing an internal structural review, and that all future payments, vendor agreements, and site access requests temporarily required re-verification through my legal counsel. It was the corporate equivalent of wrapping yellow crime scene tape around her entire aesthetic empire. Marin retaliated immediately through the court system. 2 days later, a process server handed me a thick stack of emergency motions outside my office building. She had formally petitioned the county judge for temporary spousal support and the exclusive, uninterrupted use of the carriage house and its grounds. Reading her sworn affidavit was like reading a piece of dystopian fiction. She expertly painted herself as the sole, exhausted engine of our financial prosperity, the visionary who single-handedly generated all the revenue while I was merely an administrative bottleneck. She described me as a controlling, financially abusive partner who was vindictively trying to strangle the business out of pure spite. She formally requested that I be vacated from the premises within 48 hours so she could continue operating the venue and saving our mutual livelihood. But while Marin was busy curating her flawless victimhood for the judge and her thousands of followers, the tight threads of her actual reality began to violently snap. The first incredible fracture happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in Lorraine's office reviewing the motion to vacate when her paralegal buzzed the intercom, stating we had a completely unexpected phone call from a woman named Taryn Blees. Taryn was a freelance mobile notary public who operated out of the neighboring county. She had seen the initial public filings of our case on the county docket and recognized the corporate entity names. When Lorraine put her on the speakerphone, Taryn's voice was hesitant, but extremely clear. She explained that about 4 weeks prior, Marin had reached out to her with a highly unusual and aggressive request. Marin had offered to pay triple her usual premium rate if Taryn would agree to backdate the official notarization stamps on several pages of operating agreements and vendor liability waivers. Taryn told us she had immediately refused. In her line of work, backdating legal documents was not a simple, friendly favor. It was a severe ethical violation and a fast track to losing her state license and facing criminal charges. She felt something was profoundly wrong with the desperate way Marin was pushing the issue. In a situation where everyone else was hiding behind vague claims of emotional distress and subjective truths, Taryn possessed the one thing that mattered most. She had kept the entire text message exchange. She had the formal quote she had generated for the travel time, the specific dates Marin requested for the backdating, and the official cancellation notice when Taryn firmly declined the illegal job. Lorraine asked her to forward everything to her secure server immediately. These were incredibly small, seemingly mundane administrative details, but in a divorce built entirely on a foundation of manufactured timelines and predatory restructuring, they were absolute gold. It proved Marin was actively attempting to falsify the historical record of her business maneuvers weeks before she ever slid those supposedly spontaneous divorce papers across my dining room table. The second fracture occurred just 24 hours later, completely shattering any remaining illusion that this was simply a messy emotional breakup. I was at my desk at the Seabrier office when my personal cell phone rang. It was an unrecognized number, but the area code belonged to a wealthy, exclusive suburb north of Atlanta. I answered cautiously. The voice on the other end belonged to a young woman who sounded utterly exhausted and on the verge of tears. She identified herself as a former client, a bride whose lavish wedding had been hosted at our carriage house exactly 7 months prior. She apologized profusely for calling my personal number, explaining she had found my corporate contact information on a municipal tax registry after hitting a solid brick wall with Marin. The bride was not calling to offer sympathies about the public split. She was calling about money. Specifically, she was calling about a substantial 5-figure security deposit and a massive vendor overpayment refund that Marin had legally promised to return to her within 30 days of the event conclusion. 7 months had passed. Marin had deflected the bride's inquiries with a dizzying, evolving array of excuses, switching accounting software, transitioning corporate bank accounts, undergoing unforeseen tax audits, and finally, just total, agonizing silence. The bride was terrified she was never going to see her money again and was preparing to hire a litigator to file a civil lawsuit against the venue. As I listened to this young woman cry over the phone, the entire, horrifying scope of Marin's deception locked securely into place. This was no longer just about infidelity, a stolen house, or a broken marriage. The beautiful social media posts, the emotional essays about choosing peace, the aggressive legal posturing about saving the business. It was all a massive, desperate smokescreen. Marin was not protecting a thriving enterprise. She was actively patching the gaping holes of a collapsing, fraudulent system with pretty words and stolen funds. She was using the loud, messy drama of our divorce to distract everyone from the terrifying fact that the bank vault was completely empty. I calmly took down the bride's information, assuring her I would look into the matter immediately, though I was careful to make no binding legal promises on behalf of the frozen accounts. I hung up the phone and looked out my office window at the sprawling city skyline. Marin was out there somewhere, giving the performance of a lifetime for an audience that adored her, entirely unaware that the stage she was dancing on was already turning to ash beneath her feet. The message arrived on a burner application I had set up specifically for secure communications, completely bypassing my standard phone records. It was from Celia Rowe. In the tightly knit, highly territorial Savannah wedding circuit, Celia was the undisputed keeper of secrets. She was my wife's primary accountant and one of her oldest friends in the industry. For years, Celia had been a permanent fixture at our holiday parties and summer barbecues. When the notification flashed on my screen asking me to meet her at a dilapidated, poorly lit diner on the extreme southern edge of the county, far away from the historic district and prying eyes, I assumed she had been sent as an emotional emissary. I drove there fully expecting to receive a stern, moralistic lecture about forgiveness, communication, and the sanctity of marriage. I arrived exactly at 2 p.m. The diner smelled of stale coffee and old fry grease. Celia was already sitting in a corner booth facing the door. She did not look like a woman preparing to deliver a self-righteous sermon. She looked physically ill. Her skin was sallow, Her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, and her hands were trembling slightly as she wrapped them around a chipped ceramic mug. I slid into the vinyl booth across from her. I did not offer a polite greeting. I just waited. Celia did not waste time defending her friend. She reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out 2 items. The first was a small, silver Universal Serial bus drive. The second was a thick, heavily stapled stack of printed spreadsheets, easily 40 pages deep. She pushed both items across the sticky laminate table until they rested directly in front of me. She looked me dead in the eye, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think you need to know exactly what you are about to take the fall for." I pulled the thick stack of paper toward me and flipped open the first page. It was a comprehensive, unfiltered general ledger. As my eyes scanned the columns, the terrifying financial reality I had uncovered days prior suddenly looked like child's play. Marin had not simply hidden venue debts or taken out predatory cash advances. She had crossed a line so dark and legally perilous that it bordered on sociopathic. According to the unredacted transfer logs Celia had highlighted in bright yellow ink, Marin had systematically drained a memorial scholarship fund. The fund had been established over a decade ago in the name of Marin's own late aunt to provide grants for local art students. It was a sacred, untouchable charity account that Marin managed as a trustee. The spreadsheet showed dozens of illicit withdrawals over the past 8 months. She had siphoned away nearly $60,000 of memorial money, funneling it directly into the venue's failing operating accounts. Beside the withdrawal records were printed copies of Marin's emails to Celia, casually waving off the massive ethical and legal breach by claiming she was just borrowing the cash and would quietly put it all back right after the busy fall wedding season wrapped up. She was stealing from her dead relative's legacy to pay for imported floral arrangements and custom lighting, but the devastation did not stop there. The documents definitively proved that Gavin was not just a convenient opportunist. He was the chief architect of the entire financial collapse. Attached to the back of the ledger were printed text threads between Marin and Gavin discussing how to bleed the marital estate dry. Gavin explicitly instructed Marin to approve his heavily inflated, fraudulent repair invoices. He advised her to dump those massive costs directly into our joint marital accounts, rather than the business accounts. In his own written words, he coached her to frame the hemorrhaging cash as aggressive growth investment if I ever started asking questions. He was actively teaching the host how to extract maximum capital from the secondary victim, ensuring he got paid while the debt was permanently anchored to my name. Celia took a slow, shaky breath. She confessed that for the first 6 months, she truly believed Marin was just experiencing a temporary, panic-induced lapse in judgment. Celia had spent countless hours trying to restructure the books, desperately hoping Marin would secure a legitimate loan to replace the stolen scholarship funds before the state tax board noticed. "But then," Celia said, her voice cracking, "she told me about the papers. She told me about the joke she was going to play on you at your anniversary dinner." Celia explained that the moment Marin bragged about handing me those heavily weaponized separation documents under the guise of a prank, the horrifying endgame finally snapped into focus. Marin had never intended to pay the charity back. She never intended to save the business. Her entire strategy was to legally isolate herself as the sole managing member, quietly transfer all the toxic, fraudulent debt over to my side of the marital ledger through the separation agreement, and then walk away clean. She was preparing to push me directly into the path of a massive federal fraud investigation, while she stepped into the sunlight as the tragic, financially abused victim who had to flee a suffocating marriage. Celia could not be an accessory to a malicious, premeditated frame-up that would end in a federal prison sentence. She chose to burn her oldest friendship to the ground rather than watch me get buried alive. I stared at the spreadsheets, feeling a profound, terrifying numbness spread through my chest. But the final, most agonizing twist of the afternoon was not contained in the financial ledgers. It was buried in the digital files on the small silver drive. Celia pointed to the metal device. She told me there was an internal corporate memo saved on that drive, drafted by Marin almost 3 weeks before the anniversary dinner. It was a document supposedly prepared for a legal consultation. I plugged the drive into my secure laptop right there in the diner. The memo was a masterpiece of clinical character assassination. Marin had meticulously documented a completely fabricated version of my personality. She described me as emotionally rigid, highly controlling, and potentially volatile under extreme pressure. She listed fake incidents where I supposedly lost my temper over minor household issues. It was a perfectly crafted psychological profile designed specifically for a family court judge to justify an emergency order for exclusive use of the property. As I read her cold, calculating words, a sudden, horrifying connection sparked in my mind. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together. I closed the laptop and drove straight back to the carriage house. It was entirely empty. I bypassed my study and walked directly into the kitchen. I stared up at the ceiling, looking at the small, sleek smart speakers embedded in the plaster. We used them to sync music during venue tours, but they also possessed a voice activation feature that briefly logged environmental audio commands to improve recognition accuracy. I pulled out my phone, accessed the master administrative application for the smart home system, and pulled the raw audio logs from the exact same night I had seen Gavin leaving on the back door camera footage. I matched the timestamps, 5 o'clock in the morning. I pressed play. The audio was slightly muffled, but the voices were unmistakable. It was not a romantic tryst. I stood in the dead silence of my own kitchen and listened to my wife and her lover rehearsing my destruction. They were running lines like actors in a high school play. Marin's voice echoed through the small speaker on my phone, testing different tones of accusation, asking Gavin if she sounded believable enough. I heard Gavin tell her exactly where to stand near the marble island so the hidden camera would catch my face. I heard them brainstorm the specific, deeply personal insults that would guarantee I would finally snap, lose my legendary composure, and start screaming. They were choreographing an emotional breakdown. I listened to the recording 3 times in a row. The betrayal was so absolute, so thoroughly stripped of any human empathy, that it completely eradicated whatever lingering sorrow I held. I no longer just possessed proof of a messy affair and a failing business. I now held irrefutable, undeniable evidence of a sophisticated, premeditated psychological and financial trap. Marin had spent months carefully constructing an elaborate cage designed to strip me of my home, my money, my reputation, and my freedom. But standing in that kitchen, clutching the audio logs and the catastrophic accounting ledgers, I finally understood the beautiful irony of her grand design. The very trap she thought would break me into pieces had just become the exact instrument that would guarantee her total annihilation. The deposition took place in the sterile, windowless conference room of Lorraine Beck's law firm at 9 o'clock in the morning. Marin arrived looking like a masterclass in calculated vulnerability. She wore a tailored beige suit that felt deliberately modest, her posture soft and yielding. When her own attorney guided her through her initial testimony, she leaned toward the microphone and described the thick envelope she had handed me at dinner as nothing more than an impulsive wake-up call. Her voice trembled perfectly as she painted herself as a desperately lonely wife, starved for affection, who had hastily printed a few legal templates off the internet in a momentary lapse of emotional sanity just to see if I would finally look up from my spreadsheets. Lorraine did not offer a single emotional rebuttal. She simply reached into her leather briefcase, pulled out the 60-page separation agreement, and dropped it onto the center of the heavy mahogany table. With a voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel, Lorraine walked Marin through the pure mathematics of her supposed impulse. She pointed out the highly specific commercial real estate valuations, accurate down to the exact decimal point. She highlighted the complex, 5-year vendor payment schedules and the sophisticated operational transfer clauses that were explicitly set to trigger retroactively. Lorraine stared Marin down and stated that an emotionally distressed spouse crying for help does not accidentally draft an ironclad, legally binding corporate restructuring plan on a random Tuesday night. Gavin was deposed in the afternoon session. He slouched in his leather chair, wearing a crisp, button-down shirt, attempting to play the role of the incredibly busy, oblivious general contractor who simply followed his client's orders. He swore under oath that his relationship with Marin was strictly professional. Lorraine did not argue with his hollow testimony. She just handed him a stack of his own submitted invoices and laid them side by side with a printed digital map. She asked him to explain how he managed to execute a massive, structural roof repair on our carriage house during the exact same 3 days his cellular location data showed him sitting by a rooftop pool in Charleston. She then slid over the hotel receipts, demonstrating that the luxury suite he shared with Marin was paid for using the exact amount of cash that had mysteriously vanished from our venue's operating account just 24 hours prior. Marin's attorney immediately attempted to do damage control, pivoting aggressively back to the argument that the legal documents were never meant to be filed, desperately reiterating the harmless prank defense. Lorraine silenced him by projecting the printed text messages from Taryn Blease onto the monitor at the far end of the room. Reading the panicked, high-priced offers Marin had made to a freelance notary shattered the final illusion. You do not offer to pay a legal official triple their standard rate to illegally backdate signatures on operating agreements for a simple marital joke. Backdating is the desperate act of a person trying to rewrite a financial history they know they are about to be indicted for. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to completely suffocating when Lorraine finally introduced Celia's spreadsheets. Marin's posture instantly snapped rigid. Lorraine methodically traced the flow of the stolen capital. She read aloud the specific ledger entries proving that tens of thousands of dollars meant for an art scholarship in a dead woman's name were directly funneled into payroll accounts, massive deposits for exotic flowers, and exorbitant fees paid to local social media influencers. It was an astonishing level of recklessness. This was not just a breach of fiduciary duty. It was the kind of morally bankrupt theft that would permanently obliterate the beautiful, community-focused public image Marin had spent years cultivating online. Sensing the walls closing in rapidly, Marin's legal counsel tried a desperate compartmentalization strategy. He argued that any alleged personal indiscretions between Marin and Gavin had absolutely no bearing on the corporate financial structures. That was when my professional training took over the room. I leaned forward and directed Lorraine to hand over the technical data logs I had compiled. Using my daily compliance experience, I pointed out the undeniable digital footprints. I showed the opposing counsel that the Internet Protocol addresses used to book the romantic getaways were the exact same addresses used to file the fraudulent commercial lien against my home. Furthermore, the timing of the data packets and the identical spoofed digital signature styles across all the loan applications proved that the affair and the financial fraud were not separate issues. They were the exact same coordinated enterprise, executed from the same device, by the same two people, at the exact same time. The sheer weight of the evidence forced an immediate, emergency hearing with the presiding judge later that week. Presented with undeniable proof of stolen charity funds and forged commercial liens, the judge did not offer any sympathy for Marin's poetic, online narrative of feeling small in her marriage. The gavel fell with devastating finality. The judge ordered an immediate, comprehensive emergency forensic accounting of all entities associated with Marin's name. Worse still for her, he ordered a complete freeze on a massive percentage of her incoming venue revenue until every single stolen dollar could be accurately traced and secured by the court. Sitting at the defense table, completely stripped of her social media filters and her hollow excuses, Marin actually turned a sickly, translucent pale in front of a room full of strangers. For the first time in her life, she had entirely lost control of the narrative. The true confirmation of her defeat did not happen inside the courthouse. It happened an hour later. I was walking across the scorching concrete of the parking garage toward my car when Marin stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, blocking my path. She was completely alone. The polished, defiant woman from the dining room was gone, replaced by someone thoroughly desperate and cornered. Her voice was thin, completely stripped of its usual theatrical resonance. She looked around the empty, echoing garage and quietly proposed a deal. She offered to drop all her legal demands for the property, suggested we walk away with a quiet 50-50 split of whatever cash was left, and promised to keep everything out of the public record if I just called off the forensic auditors and let her walk away. I stood there, holding my briefcase, feeling absolutely nothing for the terrified stranger standing in front of me. I looked at her, my voice completely flat and devoid of any mercy, and told her that the truth had already traveled far too deep into the light to ever be reeled back in by a soft offer. I stepped around her, got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away, leaving her standing alone in the shadows of her own collapse. Even with her accounts hemorrhaging and the forensic auditors breathing down her neck, Marin's ego refused to let her retreat into the shadows. She needed a massive injection of cash to appease the court, but more importantly, she desperately needed an audience. She announced a grand, high-profile charity gala at Hawthorne House, a sprawling historic estate she had rented specifically for the occasion. It was designed to be a blinding flash of luxury, a desperate theatrical performance to prove to the Savannah elite that she was still the undisputed queen of the social scene. She priced the tickets at $1,000 a plate, promising an evening of unparalleled elegance. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, just 4 hours before the red carpet was supposed to roll out for the wealthy donors, reality arrived at the front gates. The Bryan County Occupancy Office, a local municipal agency armed with absolute authority, descended upon the property. 3 inspectors in heavy steel-toed boots and neon safety vests walked right past the bewildered valet attendants and the frantic event coordinators. They carried metal clipboards and an emergency inspection warrant, generated from a highly detailed, anonymous tip regarding severe structural alterations and life safety code violations. The collision between Marin's curated fantasy and cold municipal law was violently fast. The inspectors tore through the majestic venue. They immediately noted that the main ballroom was configured to hold over 400 guests, massively violating the maximum occupancy load established by the fire marshal. Then, they moved to the electrical grid. Gavin had billed the event company tens of thousands of dollars for a complete, permitted rewiring of the eastern wing to support the heavy, theatrical lighting rigs Marin demanded. The chief inspector peeled back a single decorative wall panel to reveal ancient, frayed cloth wiring that had never been touched or upgraded. It was an immediate, catastrophic fire hazard, actively humming under the strain of the newly plugged-in chandeliers. The final, undeniable nail in the coffin was the fire exit. Marin had always hated the harsh industrial aesthetic of illuminated red exit signs. To preserve the visual purity of her event photography, she had ordered her team to construct a massive, cascading wall of imported white hydrangeas and heavy iron piping directly over the primary emergency egress door in the Grand Hall. The chief inspector did not negotiate. He did not care about the charity, the guest list, or the thousands of dollars worth of champagne chilling in the kitchen. He pulled a thick pad of bright red stickers from his pocket and slapped the official closure notice directly onto the heavy oak front doors of Hawthorne House. The gala was legally shut down on the spot. The scene instantly devolved into absolute, beautiful anarchy. The empire of aesthetics collapsed in front of a live audience. The massive catering trucks, realizing they were absolutely not going to get paid for the sprawling culinary spread, immediately began packing up their silver chafing dishes and rolling them back down the driveway. The local press and the social media influencers, who had arrived early for exclusive preview coverage, whipped out their phones and started live streaming the spectacular meltdown. Word spread like a digital wildfire across the internet. The brides who had been patiently waiting months for their delayed refunds suddenly saw the red tags on the doors of Hawthorne House on their social media feeds. The terrifying truth finally clicked into place for them. Their money was not tied up in a minor accounting error. Their money was completely gone, vaporized by a woman who was currently screaming at a municipal inspector in a designer gown. Where was the loyal contractor during this catastrophic collapse? Gavin Rusk evaporated the exact moment he saw the neon vests walk through the wrought iron gates. He did not stay to defend the woman he supposedly loved or the work he had supposedly completed. He got into his heavy-duty truck and drove away before the red tag was even applied to the door. Marin's phone began lighting up with a rapid succession of text messages from him. He completely severed ties, blaming her entirely for the unpermitted electrical work. He claimed in writing that she had aggressively forced him to cut corners to save money for her ridiculous floral budgets. He played the innocent victim and ran, acting exactly like the parasitic opportunist he always was when the walls finally started to crack. At exactly 5 o'clock, my phone rang. I was standing in the quiet, perfectly air-conditioned calm of my Seabriar office, watching the city traffic move far below my window. It was Marin. I answered the call. The background noise on her end of the line was deafening. I could hear people shouting, metal scaffolding clanging, and the undeniable sound of pure, unadulterated panic. Her voice was completely unrecognizable. It was a breathless, high-pitched plea, stripped of all its usual polished arrogance. She begged me to drive down to the estate immediately. She pleaded with me to use my corporate compliance background to talk to the inspectors, to find a legal loophole, to negotiate a temporary variance. She begged me to help her handle the entire situation internally so she could just get the front doors open and save her reputation. Even as the roof was caving in on her head, she genuinely believed that her social standing was still a valid, tradable currency. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I spoke with the chilling detachment of a person examining a crushed insect. I told her that I was no longer her cleanup crew. I informed her that her business was thoroughly rotten to its very core, and I had absolutely no interest in attempting to salvage a burning building that she had set on fire herself. I calmly dictated the phone number of the court-appointed financial receiver and the temporary managing attorney. I instructed her to direct all of her panic to them, and then I hung up the phone, cutting off her desperate sobs mid-sentence. But the ultimate, fatal strike of the evening did not come from the fire marshal, the fleeing contractor, or my refusal to save her. It came from the predators she had willingly invited into our financial lives. As the news of the red-tagged gala hit the local business wire, the high-interest merchant cash advance lenders panicked. They realized their primary asset was going down in flames. They immediately filed an emergency motion in civil court to accelerate the collection of her massive, toxic loans. To bypass the frozen joint marital accounts and completely avoid the messy, drawn-out process of a family court asset division, the corporate attorneys for the lenders used a very specific, brilliant piece of legal leverage. They attached a verified copy of the very same separation agreement Marin had slid across our dining room table on our anniversary. They pointed directly to the legal clause on page 4, the exact clause where Marin explicitly claimed she was the sole managing member of the enterprise, assuming full operational control. She had drafted that document as a psychological weapon. She meant it to be a cruel prank designed to intimidate me and make me feel small. Instead, my calm, immediate signature in blue ink had transformed it into an unbreakable legal anchor. The predatory lenders used her own arrogant legal maneuvering to hold her, and only her, entirely liable for every single penny of the fraudulent debt. Her empire did not just crumble, it collapsed directly onto her own shoulders, perfectly executing the very trap she had so carefully built for me. The final hearing took place after 8 grueling months of forensic audits, aggressive subpoenas, and exhausting cross-examinations. The grand, poetic narrative Marin had so carefully constructed for her online audience had completely disintegrated under the harsh fluorescent lights of the county courthouse. She no longer looked like the radiant, artistic soul breaking free from an oppressive marriage. Sitting at the defense table in a muted gray suit, she looked exactly like what she was, a cornered fraudster watching her elaborate house of cards collapse into dust. Lorraine Beck stood before the judge and delivered a masterclass in financial untangling. She did not raise her voice or appeal to the judge's emotions. She used massive, meticulously organized binders to trace the exact lineage of every single dollar. Lorraine presented the original bank transfers from nearly a decade ago, proving definitively that the core foundation of the historic carriage house was purchased and renovated entirely using my separate, inherited funds. She then laid out the complex web of Marin's hidden limited liability company, showing exactly how my wife had deliberately dragged the operational debts, the vendor liabilities, and the predatory merchant cash advances into a completely isolated legal structure that she alone controlled. Then came the witnesses. Dismantling Marin piece by piece, Celia took the stand, her voice shaking but resolute, and walked the court through the devastating spreadsheets. She testified under oath about the tens of thousands of dollars siphoned from the Memorial Scholarship Fund to pay for luxury floral arrangements and influencer marketing. Following her, Taryn, the freelance notary, confirmed the frantic text messages she had received, proving Marin had aggressively attempted to illegally backdate official corporate operating agreements. But the most suffocating moment of the trial occurred when Lorraine introduced the audio and security logs into the official record. The courtroom sat in absolute, dreadful silence as the muffled recording from my kitchen's smart speaker echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Everyone listened to Marin and Gavin casually rehearsing their psychological ambush, explicitly discussing where to place the hidden camera and how to aggressively provoke me into a manufactured emotional explosion just days before the anniversary dinner. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the divorce papers were never a spontaneous cry for help. They were the final step in a heavily premeditated trap designed to steal my home and destroy my character. I sat perfectly still, watching Marin from across the aisle. As the audio tape clicked off, I saw something fundamental break behind her eyes. In that sterile courtroom, staring at the mountain of undeniable evidence, Marin finally understood the exact sequence of her own demise. She realized that the fatal blow had not been the fire marshal shutting down her glamorous charity gala. It had not been Gavin abandoning her at the first sign of real trouble. The actual irreversible moment of her destruction happened months ago, in our dining room. It was the exact moment I picked up my silver fountain pen, looked her in the eye, and calmly signed my name on the dotted line of her weaponized legal documents. She thought she was handing me a weapon to use against myself, but in truth, she had given me the key to her own prison cell. The judge's final ruling came swiftly and without a trace of mercy. He flatly denied Marin's petition for temporary spousal support and exclusive use of the property. Citing the overwhelming evidence of financial misconduct and the blatant breach of fiduciary duty, he ordered that the vast majority of the staggering operational debt remain permanently attached to the corporate entity Marin had created and managed. Furthermore, he explicitly recognized her malicious conversion of my separate property, ordering a heavy financial offset in my favor to compensate for the heirloom furniture and antique fixtures she had illegally pledged as collateral to her predatory lenders. As for Gavin, he never even set foot inside the courtroom. The moment he realized the sheer magnitude of the federal fraud implications surrounding the stolen charity funds and the forged commercial liens, he scrambled to save himself. He secured his own legal counsel, quietly agreed to a private financial settlement to avoid a drawn-out civil suit regarding his fraudulent construction invoices, and immediately lost his operating license in our county. He faded into absolute obscurity, proving true to his ultimate nature. He was never a devoted partner or a master builder. He was merely a cheap parasite, entirely loyal only to the places where the money flowed easily, abandoning the host the second the well ran dry. I did not keep the wedding business. The very thought of hosting another manufactured, high-stress event in my home made my blood run cold. As soon as the legal dust settled and the courts formally dissolved the commercial entity, I shut the venue down permanently. I spent the next 6 months aggressively undoing Marin's aesthetic damage. I ripped out the gaudy imported chandeliers, dismantled the massive floral rigging points, and slowly restored the carriage house back to its original, quiet dignity as a private residence. A year later, I opened the doors again, but under a completely new, clean name. I repurposed the sprawling guest suites and the quiet gardens into small, private retreat spaces specifically designed for authors, poets, and independent artists seeking absolute silence. There were no flashing cameras, no demanding influencers, and no desperate attempts to prove anything to the outside world. It was a space built entirely on peace, funded by my own hard work, and legally protected by my own relentless vigilance. On the exact 1-year anniversary of the night my marriage ended, I found myself sitting completely alone in my renovated kitchen. The house was wonderfully quiet, filled only with the soft sound of rain hitting the old glass panes. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy silver fountain pen I carried with me every single day. I rolled the cool metal between my fingers, feeling the familiar weight of it. Marin had slid those papers across the table, believing that a signature was an act of total surrender. She thought my adherence to the rules, my quiet discipline, and my supposed lack of passion made me the perfect, compliant victim for her beautiful, chaotic narrative. But as I sat there, looking around the home that belonged entirely to me, I knew the absolute truth. That signature was never a concession. It was the exact moment I took the pen from her hand, crossed out her lies, and reclaimed the absolute right to write the rest of my own story. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to this story to the very end, and I would love to hear where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Please subscribe to Violet Revenge Stories, like the video, and support by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by even more people.